Will you drink to the earth and to the days which have passed upon it? Will you drink to the fullness which was, and to friends who have passed on? Will you drink to good company well met?
Let's examine how well some of their predictions about Sweden held up. And one kind of the premier example really is this Imperial College of London model, which that was the Neil Ferguson's operation that these were the projections that policymakers around the world were using to determine what kind of policy to implement. And what they predicted for Sweden, I just pulled some of the numbers from their projections. And again, as always, our sources are linked in the description of the video and at reason.com. But in green here, this is their range of predictions if Sweden social distanced the whole population using a lockdown strategy. The total deaths they project are between about 30,000 and 42,000. In red, this is the unmitigated strategy. This is, if Sweden doesn't do lockdowns, which is the policy they pursued, they're projecting between 66,000 and 90,000 deaths in Sweden. The reality here, I pulled from the WHO's COVID-19 dashboard. By the way, this projection was for July 1st. So deaths by July 1st, 2020. Deaths by July 2nd, 2020 were 14,633. So about half of the projection with a mitigation strategy. And then, the total death rate was, I think not even 30,000 at the end of the day from COVID-19. Continuing through, putting Sweden in the context of other countries. This is from your policy paper, a slide that I pulled, Johan. We see Sweden's COVID death rate is pretty much in the middle of the pack when you take all of Europe and the US into account, with 2,322 deaths per million. And then this was the really striking one. You'll see Sweden at the very bottom of this chart because Sweden's excess death rate during the pandemic was the lowest in Europe. What do we take from this fact right here? Why do we have any theories as to why Sweden actually had fewer excess deaths than the rest of the continent?
Yeah, this is a shocker, that those numbers. And it tells you, first of all, I think that don't put too much trust in models like that, because they can't really make a serious forecast, because it was all based on just two options, shutting down societies or just business as usual, and everybody lives exactly like they did before the pandemic. They didn't have room for people actually on a voluntary basis doing things like working from home, trying to avoid public transportation if they could, and so on. So that's obviously a major factor behind this data. And then when it comes to total excess deaths over the 3 pandemic years compared to the 3 previous years, the fact that Sweden actually had the lowest accrued excess death rate in Europe and less than half of America's, that comes as a surprise to most people. And let me just say that you can adjust those numbers in different ways according to the years to compare it to, age structure, health structure in the population. According to some ways of doing this, Denmark beats us to first place, but we're almost the lowest excess death rates, much lower than countries like Finland, for example, who seem to be doing better during the pandemic. So it tells you that it's not necessarily this dramatic trade-off between liberty and health.
But what's been suggested is some kind of supposed link between Sweden or the Swedish and a lack of respect for Islam.
Sweden's international image is of a sensible, liberal and safe nation. So how exactly did it become the gun crime capital of Europe?
Gun crime in Sweden is increasing at a faster rate than anywhere else in Europe. To put it into context, the European average for gun deaths is 1.6 people per million. In Sweden last year, it was 4 people per million.
Earlier this week, a young Swedish activist managed to suspend a Turkish aircraft carrier from departing Gothenburg Airport by refusing to sit down. The reason for this was to prevent a 52-year-old man from Afghanistan, who was also on the plane, from being deported. I'm going to use this incident as a starting point for a discussion on the law, subjective opinion, and civil disobedience in Sweden. Stay tuned. The identity crisis of the formerly self-proclaimed humanitarian superpower of Sweden has, in recent years, been playing out for open curtains. Providing the world's most generous welfare system combined with an open border policy proved unsustainable in 2015 when the left-wing government was forced to implement border controls on the Öresund bridge, which connects Sweden with the European continent. The border controls were controversial and has led to an increasingly polarized debate climate in Sweden. A vocal and influential identitarian minority across the political spectrum is now advocating civil disobedience, claiming the less open borders to be a violation of human rights. On the other end of the spectrum, a seeming majority of voters are now turning to the authoritarian right and siding with the Sweden Democrats on the issue of increasingly restrictive immigration. In order to understand the present state of conflict, some background is necessary. During the fall of 2015, the flow of asylum seekers and immigrants to Sweden reached unsustainable levels, with more than 10,000 refugees arriving weekly as the crisis peaked.
It is not quite on a biblical scale, but an exodus it certainly is.
In total, Sweden received over 162,000 refugees during 2015, overwhelming the Department of Immigration and vital infrastructure. As a result, the asylum application processing times slowed to a crawl, as many of the asylum seekers had no way of proving their identities. A large majority were also claiming to be under the age of 18, legally making them eligible for status as unaccompanied children, granting them a higher probability of permanent resident status. In another controversial move, age controls were gradually implemented during 2016 and 2017, and a vast majority of the asylum seekers had their age adjusted upwards, no longer deeming them acceptable to be defined as children. This again led to massive protest from the left wing and from the refugees, who initiated months-long strikes in central Stockholm, refusing to accept the decision of the immigration court. As deportations of those not deemed eligible for asylum beginning to be carried out, the identitarian fringe is getting increasingly confrontational. Last Monday, 21-year-old activist Elin Ersson bought a ticket for a flight bound for Afghanistan via Istanbul and refused to be seated unless she and the 52-year-old Afghan man scheduled for deportation were escorted off the flight together. Ms. Ersson filmed the whole incident on a smartphone, and the video quickly went viral.
What I'm all saying is that I'm not going to sit down until this person is off the plane.
Swedish activists who engage in this type of civil disobedience view themselves as operating in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, heroically and selflessly putting themselves at risk opposing an oppressive and morally bankrupt system for the sake of the greater good. Nothing could be further from the truth. The civil rights movement activists were intensely knowledgeable about the law and how to work within the system to bring about change, letting activist stunts serve to draw attention to the issues and the work they were actually doing.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper.
The Swedish identitarian movement are generally ill-educated, and there is little actual work being done aside from the hot air blown about during demonstrations, protests and civil disobedience like the one conducted by Ms. Ersson. In fact, Ms. Ersson falsely believes her actions to be perfectly legal.
This is all perfectly legal, and I have not committed a crime.
Let me emphasize that it is absolutely not legal at all to prevent an international aircraft carrier from taking off. Not only is it incredibly expensive, with each hour of delay incurring the carrier hundreds of thousands in airport fines, it is also arbitrarily inconsiderate for all the hundreds of people with connecting flights on the plane. Actions like these are in violation of the Aviation Law, Chapter 13, Paragraph 4, Section 10, and should result in heavy fines or prison up to 6 months. This information is readily available on Google and serves as an illustration of how ill-prepared and devoid of practical knowledge large parts of the Swedish activist movement really is. Activist activity with no legal grounding render attention, but attention must not be confused with what affects real change. This is just noise. On a side note, a sign of the times is that Ms. Ersson, the day after her video, set up a new Facebook page establishing herself as a lecturer. In my book, she actually scores some points for capitalizing on her virality here, but as far as affecting change, no. This is all words and feelings. In Sweden, this type of activism is generally put on a pedestal of virtue, which both publicly elected officials and journalists engage in. In 2014, representative of the Left Party, Malin Björk, performed a similar protest, preventing a plane headed for Iran from taking off. This move, paired with a wide-eyed conversation upon being confronted with its illegality, rendered her a lot of press and catapulted her political career into the European Parliament. In 2011, Member of Parliament of the Centre Party, Abir Al-Shalani, conducted an equally illegal deportation protest at Stockholm Airport. Al-Shalani was subsequently relieved from her duties on embezzlement charges. In 2017, 3 journalists working for public service television were convicted for illegal people smuggling, and the list goes on and on and on. There is nothing wrong with empathy and humanitarianism. On the contrary. But a decision to oppose the law requires thorough deliberation, preparation, and a deep understanding and knowledge in order to achieve the desired effect.
I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
The rule of law is difficult to change for a reason. It is meant to withstand short-term opinions and feelings in order to uphold the principle of objectivity before which all citizens are deemed equal. This is not to say that the law is infallible. On the contrary, it's often very flawed indeed. However, if we wish to maintain a parliamentarian democracy, it is imperative that we respect the law and diligently and expertly work to change it through democratic processes.
The world is perishing from an orgy of self-sacrificing. My terms are a man's right to exist for his own sake.
An activist protest, like that of Rosa Parks, became a powerful instrument of change because it brought attention to the legal work being done by the civil rights movement. Preventing random planes from taking off are superficial publicity stunts with no lasting effect, except for sacrificing the status of rule of law on the altar of arbitrary self-righteousness and disrespect. In fact, it is likely counterproductive, as the blanket of protection and freedom these activists rise and sleep under gradually grows thinner as a result of their own doing.